Good evening, everyone, and welcome to City of Literature at Norfolk and Norwich Festival 2021. City of Literature is a Norfolk and Norwich Festival and National Centre for Writing presentation programmed by the National Centre for Writing. My name is Peggy Hughes, and I'm Programme Director at the National Centre for Writing. I want to thank you for joining us for this very special event in which we welcome Jay Bernard, award-winning author of Surge, and sound designer, DJ and music producer Mwen, who will discuss their new commission, Tombland, undertaken during Jay's time as associate artist with us at the National Centre for Writing. Jay and Mwen will be joined by Jenny Niven, freelance creative producer and director of Push the Boat Out, Edinburgh's new international poetry festival. They will take us behind the scenes of Tombland to explore how this extraordinary new work came about. Very special thanks go to Arts Council England, whose Ambition for Excellence Fund has made this event possible. I hope you enjoy this conversation and that it sparks your interest in exploring Tombland further. Without any more from me, I'm delighted to hand over to Jay, Mwen and Jenny.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Hi, Jay and Wen. Thank you for speaking with me and with the festival attendees today. My name is Jenny Niven. I'm based in Edinburgh, which is another sister city of literature to Norwich. And I'm really excited to have been asked to help reveal a bit more today about this wildly inventive experimental commission that you two have been working on over the last little while. But before we begin and jump in, I thought I might ask each of you just to introduce yourself a little bit first, just to set the context for the work we're going to delve into and just to get things going. So, Jay, if we could start with you, if you don't mind. Many of the audience, I think, will be familiar with your incredible poetry collection, Surge. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, about your work as a poet and about your practice as an interdisciplinary artist, which is very relevant for this mad project that we're talking about today?
Yeah, so Surge is a very specific book of poems, and is, part of my general interest in social history and the kind of haunted nature of archives, records, the past, history, how we engage with it. This project is quite different to Surge. After 4 or 5 years of talking about the kind of heavier side of the New Crossfire, I thought I'd like to do something a bit lighter. And that turned into Tombland, which is, as you say, an interdisciplinary piece, really, that emerged out of Mwen and I going down to Dragon Hall, and I think engaging with just a different side of my practice, which is the kind of music, recording, sound, resonance, kind of all of that stuff. So yeah, it's the outcome is a game this time, which is another of my interests, programming and
yeah, brilliant. Like that. So when the second half of what Jay was saying there, the sound and the resonance and the acoustic and things, that's more of your kind of entry into this project and your artistic background and practice. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, I essentially work with sound creatively in whatever context I find myself in, I guess. I do that in theatre, I produce music, I DJ, I just interact with sound in a lot of different ways. And so I think what was interesting about doing sort of this project is that usually if I say, for example, I'm doing sound design in a theatre space, you're the space becomes something that you're trying to control in a way. You're trying to control what the acoustics are doing, how they're impacting how they impact how an audience member, for example, is going to be able to perceive what's happening in a central location. So it's kind of more about suppression of the space, controlling the space. But this was more about what is this space? What can we get out of this space? Like, how do we interact with this space? How do we appreciate it? Like, especially it not being a space that was created for sound. It's a space that has a whole history, energy. It's a unique space that's not exactly for the purposes of you performing in it or anything like that. And I think that was the most interesting part for me as a sound designer, to come to it from. Is like, actually, how do I feel about what I'm hearing in this space without trying to control it, without trying to manage it in some kind of specific way, without kind of being receptive rather than suppressive. I think that's like the two energies you normally get if you're doing kind of sound design in spaces. It's like we can maybe work with this resonance to support something else that's happening in the space. But on this occasion, it was kind of just the space.
It's such an interesting way to think about it. And when I've listened to the sample, like the material that you guys have already produced from it, there is that feeling of just like hewing the sound out of the space and kind of drawing out what's already there. It's totally fascinating. But before we get into that a little bit more, Jay, the commission came about because you've been an associate artist with the National Centre for Writing this year. Is that right? Do you want to just tell us a wee bit of the background of that relationship and what that entails and what, yeah.
As from what I understood, it's quite an open brief. I personally was interested in coming down to Dragon Hall and to Norwich, and engaging with the space. And when I first did a tour, this is very initially, just to kind of see what was possible. I was really taken with the kind of history of the area, to see the little room where Anchoress was sort of wailing and flagellating herself and all that kind of stuff. So
tell us that story. I don't know that story. Who is she? Why is she flagellating herself?
Julian of Norwich is a really famous character, I suppose, to come out of Norwich. And there's a little cell in a church right by the centre that I think it's not the original, but I think it's built on where she would have basically spent her days, in just religious devotion, sort of praying and sort of denying herself worldly pleasures, that kind of thing. She's the person who's responsible for the quite famous and oft quoted phrase that all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. So that really inspired me, and I thought about the moans and the screams, and I thought about hearing the voices outside if you're confined to this cell. All of that was kind of part of it. So that's the direction I took as associate artist. I didn't feel in any way like I had to kind of do poetry for this or anything like that. It just felt like I was going to just respond to the space and work with what came up.
What does it look like for somebody who hasn't been there? What is the feeling and the experience, and what are you seeing when you first go into Dragon Hall?
It's both grander and more intimate than you might imagine. From the outside, you can see it, that it's this kind of, I wouldn't say it was like particularly striking from the outside, but you can see there's a difference between that and some of the other buildings around it. It's kind of like surrounded by new builds and other stuff as well. And it's when you go in and you first sort of go up the little stairs. I personally was really struck by the roof. I think that's the first thing I did. You kind of go up the stairs and you sort of look up, and there's just this incredible structure above you, which looks like the sort of the bottom of a ship, I suppose. It looks like a kind of inverted ship. And then you've got all of these sort of walled and gnarled beams that kind of, hold the building up for, on the sides. And then you've got all of these sort of little windows as well. They tended not to do things in the kind of rigid way that we do them now. It's sort of, there's a window there and a window there, and there's a bit of the top of the window leans down slightly, and it's all a bit sort of higgledy-piggledy, and that gives it its charm. So yeah, it's an impressive space. I don't know how you first felt when you went in there, Mwen.
I think that was a really great way to describe it, where it does a certain level of grandeur, but also intimacy, and a certain kind of like density to it. Like immediately you step in the space, you like the first thoughts are how many bodies have passed through this space and how long have they been doing that? How many different ways has this space been used? And it just, and you have, because like you say, there was like new builds surrounding it, and kind of the architecture that you're used to, but then you get this kind of architecture that's really misaligned. It's not perfect. It kind of seems a bit more just kind of created over time out of necessity or something like this. And I remember thinking the windows, for example, were really interesting. Like there'd be those really small windows, and I was just fascinated by how they weren't, symmetrical and all this kind of like very functional stuff that I've just come to assume. You see a house, somebody has very specifically thought about the dimensions, and it just didn't feel that way there. I think that was the first like kind of jolt to think about how interesting the space is. Yeah, I think that just sort of the grandeur and then the intimacy was great, and the beams are really beautiful. Like there's the kind of beams that you described. It's like a really beautiful thing to just look at the first moment you kind of come up the stairs, and then you just, because there's for example towards the back of the space there's this kind of fireplace, and then you're instantly wondering what time am I in? It's just there's a certain level of, I want to say, interdimensional time travel you feel when you walk into the space, but that's
quite literally though, because it is a palimpsest. I don't know what the architectural word for palimpsest is, but you can literally sort of feel the kind of ancient building, and then the people who kind of like lived through it. There's witch burnings, I think, like where people used to sort of burn the wood and then rub on it, which Peggy showed me, and that was fascinating. And then the fireplace had like a radiator in it, which was weird. And then there's also the history of the building as like having been it was used as a trading hall, I think, at one point, and then it became housing, and people were actually living in there, and then it kind of was boarded up for ages, and then I think in the 70s they rediscovered it, and so they kind of patched up, so you can really see all of that accumulation of kind of human life.
And that speaks to the sort of subtitle of the piece, Jay, doesn't it? It's the, excuse me, a conversation between the living and the dead. Can you tell us a bit more about how you landed on that?
Yeah, I mean, day one, we go into the hall, and when we basically set up, we're like, bedding in, like connecting everything, and finally Mwen managed to sort of sort out the sort of PA, I guess. I don't know what it's called. And we had these mics, and then we just kind of started chatting. And that first conversation, I think, really directed where we went thereafter. We basically just spent like an hour talking. You can listen to the whole thing on the website. Yeah, and I think we literally left spaces and gaps for the ghosts to reply if they wanted to. If they wanted to call in, they could. None did. We need to work on our outreach. But it was like a really good conversation. I think there was just something really fun and kind of light and a little bit silly, but also I think a little bit serious about it. Like in the conversation, we talk about communing with the past and what that means, and the way that has been sort of both glorified and vilified in sort of equally distorting extremes, if you know what I mean. But just how wonderful it felt to just imagine that those people were listening. It was a really good exercise.
I suppose, sorry, Mwen.
Oh no, I was going to say, and I think I disagree that we didn't commune. I think the work is the communion. I think we did do all the ghost justice. We did them service with pulling them directly into the work. I think that was, I'd consider that communing.
It's true, actually, because at one point we did say, like, you guys don't have to you don't have to call in if you don't want to. Like, and actually, this is about doing something for you. So rather than it being like, yeah, you've got to like testify, instead, how about we entertain you for once? How about we do some reverse haunting? Anyway. Yeah.
Do you believe in ghosts? Is that something that you took with you in already?
Absolutely. I think I live with one right now, so it's hard to not believe in them, I think, for me.
I have a contrarian nature, so I'm going to say that I think I don't know if I believe in ghosts in the kind of way that maybe it's framed and pitched. Like, I love watching paranormal shows and stuff like that because you can just see how much of it is being invented. I love it, but I absolutely do believe in communing and understanding and recognizing history, and that it is passed down. So I don't know if that's ghosts per se, but I believe in something being kind of experienced later down the line, for sure.
So within Surge, you spent a lot of time looking at the New Cross fires in 1981, and then in the process of writing that collection, Grenfell happened. So there's a dialogue there between past and present, but with a span of 40 years. Had you ever worked on anything before with such a long time span as Tombland?
Yeah, I did a pamphlet actually a few years ago, where I responded to a the Dutch canon of the Arthurian legends, and there's a story in there, which is the story of Sir Morian, who is a kind of a black knight, but he's like literally black, so it's a really strange story. He's a black knight who travels to Camelot to find his father, and that's just as old, even older. I wasn't working directly with the manuscripts. Unfortunately, every time I went to Brussels to possibly go to the Royal Library where the manuscript is held, there was some kind of international crisis. So I haven't been able to actually hold or touch or even see the originals, but they are online, so you can see this kind of illuminated script. And it, I worked with that a couple of years ago. So actually, this is kind of like almost a return to that kind of mindset and that interest that I had.
That's interesting. So I guess for me, some of the most interesting kind of commissions are ones where you start out at the beginning with one perceived idea of what might come out of it, and then ultimately it's something completely different. How did Jay kind of first propose this to you, and how did you become involved, and what were your expectations at the start?
I mean, I've worked with Jay before, and I think I learned very quickly, don't have expectations, just make sure to go in open and creatively ready. And so when they told me that they were doing this project, I didn't go in with expectations. I think that's part of how we are able to make things that are so interesting. That seems like a shabby way to describe what I actually feel about the project. But the idea was, let's see what emerges, essentially. And I think from working with them more than once now, it's quite easy to trust that process. So I don't necessarily have to be too prescriptive. I think I just needed to take my tools with me, and the tools being sort of like my software, my synthesizers, my knowledge, that kind of thing, and then just see together what was to come out of it. But I think I specifically loved the idea of me as a sound designer coming to a project like this, because I don't think that's not the kind of thing that quite often is the realm of sound design. Like, quite often, if you're asking a sound designer to come into a space, you're asking them to solve a problem for you. In this case, it was, let's create something in the space, and I think ultimately that was the underlying grip. It's like, let's create something in response to a space in a space, and you say things like that to me, and my creative excitement just goes to 100.
Which speaks to what you were saying at the beginning about, rather than kind of manipulating and controlling an existing space, it was sort of about freeing and finding out what was under the skin. So what was under the skin? What did you find acoustically when you started to record?
I think, ultimately spaces generally will have their own characteristics. That's always the case. But I think with this one, it just felt a bit more pronounced than usual, because you might have than the spaces I would normally, for example, be trying to create and generate sound in. In those spaces, you've generally tried to make it so that the space is not having too much of a conversation with you. And by us kind of wandering around the space, it was really amazing to hear just how impactful the acoustics were. Like we'd have, at one point we just had one specific drone just playing. I think that's the snippet in the video, and just seeing how the space responds to that one sound coming from one location around the space, and how even a sound that I've generated quite a few times, I'd say, or like a similar sound, I could hear so very differently by hearing it in that space and hearing how the reverberations were in different parts. I think there's a point where it's kind of, we're quite close to a wall, and I'm like, but it sounds like it's coming from the wall and something like this, which is, historically, or in another kind of sound design practice, that would be a real problem. I would be like, there is too much resonance here. We need to find a way to dampen this section. But it was a really freeing opportunity to just really enjoy that. To enjoy, I guess the way I would describe it is like to enjoy a space singing along, or just, I think that's the best way to describe it for me, really. Which is, as somebody who's in sound, because I love sound and I love how it makes it, how you can emote through sound, and I love just the idea that it's an energy and things resonate. It was really refreshing as well to come into the space also, after lockdown and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And to just allow a space to respond with sound and to just sit in it, to be steeped in it. It was really...
And how did things like you mentioned before, like the irregularity of the windows and, the kind of higgledy-piggledy nature of it, how did that translate into sound that would be different from a regimented, symmetrical sort of building?
I think for me, in terms of when I kind of went away to develop more of the sound world, the things that stuck with me was, and I think it came out in the way Jay kind of, I guess, created the schematic for the game, is that different pitches were very pronounced in particular parts of the space, and it then became very visceral to think of how sound was bouncing off the walls. Like there's one particular place where you could literally take a step forwards and there would be a drop in decibel volume, like it would get quieter in such a significant way that you'd be like, oh, if I stand here, listen to how I feel so pressured by the sound, and if I stand here, it's like it's just evaporated. Which is, it's a phenomenon that occurs in lots of spaces all the time. But I think in the context of what we were doing there, it was quite, I want to say soul shaking. I'm using a lot of big, big words or big metaphors, but that's kind of how it felt, to really be able to sit down and appreciate that, or stand and appreciate that.
And to add as well, one of the best things about sound is that you can't really ever record the same sound twice, if that makes sense. And that was particularly interesting in the space, because we were going in every day and kind of playing the stuff using the loop machine. I was making all these weird sounds and all the rest of it. And there's something about having recorded simply what was done rather than tried to make something that would be repeated in exactly each time, that brings the space to the listener, but not in the way that audio, music is recorded a lot these days, where you've got these kind of really almost regimented different sections and different channels, and it's all kind of manipulated. Actually, what we were doing was like, this has been recorded here today, and that's it. There's no other. So even when I, changed the sounds digitally and was like placing them around, I wasn't trying to make them sound like clean or anything like that. You literally hear the muffles, you hear the echoes, you hear all the interference. That was, I think, important to make a record of the space that wasn't about, as you said, when controlling it.
How much does that speak to this really strange contemporary moment that we are in? This might be an overreach. I don't want to assume anything, but there's something about the way that you're talking about this experience, when about it being creative, really freeing for you. And for you, Jay, there's a sense that it could only have happened right at this particular time in this particular place. How much did the overall kind of weird environmental context that we're all in this year and this moment feed into all of that?
I've thought about that a lot. And I think one of the dangers of this last year is that we might over attribute things to it, right? I think what we were doing is something that we do all the time. But I think we were just a little bit more attuned to it, partly because we were in such a unique space. Sure, coming out of lockdown, and I think we were in that sliver of time when things eased for a little bit, and we kind of went down, and it was really nice and all the rest of it. But I don't know if I would attribute necessarily what we did to the lockdown. I will say though that when I started thinking about the game bit, and when I was kind of building it, it did occur to me that, and I've had this conversation with other people since, it has occurred to me that like people, or rather, I feel like we're part of maybe a shift, where we're not trying to make things with objectives and goals, but we're trying to make things that are meditative, experiential. Happenstance and serendipity is just as important as objectives and goals. And I think that is maybe more evident in the game. So yes, I think I think there has been an attitudinal shift. But I would say that a lot of the practices that have led us to this point, I would say we had them before, to be honest with you. Improvisation, just seeing how things go, walking around. Those are practices that have always informed the way I've written and the way I've approached art. So,
how about you, Mwen?
I mean, I would agree in terms of the way it was enacted is like a fundamental part of my creative process with sound. I'm very much about improvisation and capturing kind of things without too much repetition or too much questioning of kind of how something is coming into being. But I will say that I think, unlike historically in the last year, I'd actually spent an enormous amount of time like predominantly in silence. So like I wasn't listening to that much music. I wasn't, excavating that much sonic art at all over the last year. I was very much in a meditative space for most of 2020. So I think that probably would have had an impact in how open I was to what came out of what we created, and also just kind of embracing what the sound was feeling like and sounding like, and really wanting to allow that to breathe, because there'd been a lot of space, I guess, created inside myself, I'd say, like for that. So I think that is probably as far as I'd say the cultural, or like cultural, social, political, the current moment would have impacted it for me personally. Was just how I'd spent a time retreating, I guess, from sound a lot, and mostly just only observing natural sound. And I'm been living in very peaceful areas, so only really hearing small smash of like nature and things like that. Not hearing recorded or electronic sound reverberating so much off of any space. So it probably lent itself to a certain kind of openness and curiosity that had some time to just take a rest. It's always part of my toolkit, but I had just had some time off, essentially.
A bit of a recharge. So can you tell us about the game then? So first you started with the recordings, the field recordings, and what you just said about Julian of Norwich and that kind of keening sound that comes across in Sad Eyes. It's so fascinating to think about that in relation to the technical things and the acoustic things that you were saying when about like the decibels dropping and stuff, and like the kind of confluence of that narrative bit plus the acoustics themselves. It's so brilliant the way that you've brought all that together. Can you just talk a little bit about those tracks that people could hear on the website, and then how that evolved into the game?
Part of, I think, what my role is as somebody whose practice is sound based, and I'm a creative sound practitioner, I guess I would call it. A lot of what I do is finding what emotes, or kind of trying to really take in, I want to say, just like the energy of an experience, really take in the room. It's because, like, if I'm, for example, if I'm doing sound design in theatre, I very much love to be in the rehearsal room because I think there's something that I'm taking in by osmosis. I think that imprints in me in some kind of way, whether it's in my body or just like in a very specific way that I'm conceptualizing something. So then to carry on the sound world beyond, because some of the sound world is directly what we recorded in the space, and then some of it is my then creative input in studio. Right. And I think that's very easy. That part is very easy to me once I've got that initial imprint from the space. So I was able to go and use my other instruments that I have, my other synthesizers, my library of samples, all my other kind of tools that weren't specifically generated in that space, to then identify other additional sounds that were still within what I had taken from the experience, what I had taken from the space, what we had kind of discovered in that real time. And so I think that's how the 33, I mean, am I allowed to say all the objects? But that's how the multiple objects in the game came to be, is like a combination of physically pulled from the space and then pulled from kind of what I'd extracted from the experience.
Yeah, so in those tracks, it's mainly sort of my voice in those tracks, and it was really interesting to like there's a bunch of videos as well, which at some point I'll upload, where I kind of recorded myself making those tracks, and there was a lot of Mwen and I sort of standing there really. And like I would do something, and then Mwen would do something, and then I would just be listening to the loop going round and round and round until something else came, right? So, and then each one fed off the other one, right? So there's one track in there which is called I Cannot Sleep, and that I think was like the product of maybe 2-3 days of just like having like a note or a sound or like a thing that just kind of developed, and then suddenly I was like, I cannot sleep, and then I was like, oh, what can I say after that? Like, what's a good lyric to come thereafter? Like, so it was almost like I was writing in real time on a lot of those tracks. Like I was kind of coming up with sort of texts almost, but visually you can also kind of see the space. And aurally, you can hear the space too. You can just like, you can hear that I've looped something and then I've like deleted something else and then kept going with it. You know, the whole track is in and of itself a process of adding and subtracting. And that was, I think that was kind of like key really to then how the game developed thereafter.
So Jay, do you want to just describe the game? I think by the time people see this event, they'll be able to go in and have a play with it on the site themselves. But what do you find there if you're coming at it cold for the first time?
Yeah, so the game, we decided to call it Tombland. That's the name of an area nearby, and that was also complete chance. I think Peggy walked in and was like, you should, if you want to get good food, walk down to Tombland. And we were both like, Tombland! Okay, that's it, it's done. So the game is basically Dragon Hall itself. I was thinking, we can't do a live performance of this, so let's bring the space to viewers, to the audience. especially as it is a very unique space and not everybody will have had an opportunity to kind of like visit. I was like, actually, this could be like a really nice thing. And then within the game, you are a disembodied presence. You're actually just kind of a strange purple hand floating in a room, and you can move anywhere in the space. You can go up into the roof if you like, you can go down on the floor, you can go into any corner. And all around the room are the sounds that we created while we were there. So you can float and just hear them as you float into them if you want to do that, or you can arrange them into sort of like clusters, into paths if you want to. So as you move through one of the balls, it activates so you can hear it, and if you click it, it will stay on. And so what you can then do is create almost like little like little clusters of sounds. And as you move away from the sound, just as in real space, it gets quieter because it's a 360 sound experience. As it gets quieter, so you can move something from the roof, like a resonance that is like happening way up in the roof. You can like grab it and move it down to the floor, and then we can take something that is from the floor but is like a deep rumbling sound, or like like a much deeper, like a lower pitch, and you can kind of move it up into the top. You can do all kinds of stuff in space. But principally, it's about it's a meditative experience. There's no objective to the game. There's no goal. There's no points. There's nothing. It's just you can float through this, and you can listen to us talking if you want. You can listen to the sound on loop if you want. You can have it playing in the background if you want. That's the idea.
When you were kind of thinking about, I imagine you had a really strong hand in choosing which bits of audio then were placed in which bits of the gamified version of Dragon Hall. Is it kind of like a sort of audio description of what you were hearing when you were in that space, or how would you relate to it, and how would you describe it?
I know I wouldn't want to say I had too much of a hand in the placing. I think that was very much something I was happy to hand over to Jay in that point. Just kind of my main goal was to recreate, so anybody can kind of recreate how I sonically experienced that, how I felt that, what the because it I think the project had a very strong palette, like sound palette, that I could put together. Like I didn't have any questions about that. I wasn't unsure about any aspect of what sound kind of fit into that, how I experienced this space. So I think for me it was just more along the lines to that if you could play all of the sounds at once, did I feel like it hit all the registers of the experience that I had in that space? Which is something that I did do once I had kind of created the whole sound bank. So just play it all at once, and to like right on top of each other, and to see, does this sound like Tombland to me? And it absolutely does. You can play one sound, or you can play all the sounds, or you can play a combination of sounds, and I felt back in the space, and that was kind of my objective. Didn't really matter to me where it then was in that space. It's more about, where does that take you? What does that emote? What kind of drops in? What do you kind of what does it bring up? All that kind of stuff. That's kind of more the direction I took with it. But I wouldn't say that I had any kind of desire, expectation, or too much of a hand in specifically where sound should be, because I don't think that was important in the way that we actually ended up, delivering the project.
So you said that you'd worked together before, but this was obviously quite an intensive period of time creating together. What would you say has changed? What would you come out of having worked together? How things have evolved between you creatively in your journey together at Tombland, at Dragon Hall? Jay?
I mean, I feel like I've been asking Mwen these questions for at least the past like 3 years, of just like, how do you do that? Like, what's the bit of equipment? Because when you don't understand someone else's practice, or like someone else's skill, let's be real, there's always like a gap you're like, okay, I can see that you're achieving something, but I don't know how you do it. And to this day, I don't know how to build. I don't know how to make music basically on a computer. I don't know how you do it. I've tried. I once downloaded Ableton and just looked at it and was like, cool. This is not for me. And I've had an RC30 for years, and I've kind of like played around with it, but I've just never been able to like progress really. It's just not. Whereas, so like working with Mwen has been really interesting because I feel like I've managed to create things that have been in my head this entire time. We worked, for example, like on my solo show. So Mwen did the whole sound design for that, and to this day, I still think about. There's a particular like chiming sound that came towards the end of the show that I just was like, that is exactly how it sounded. That in my head, that's how that poem sounds. So for me, it's like it's more like a kind of like ongoing gratitude, I suppose, that somebody can create things that are in my head, and can also like put things there too. And I don't know how it happens or what's going on.
I mean, I would argue that is like the center of my practice. Is literally just that relationship. Is, I think, so, you know, Jay will say things like, I can't make music, I can't write all these things, I can't, but I'm not doing it in a vacuum. I'm doing it in collaboration with somebody. We are creating a sound world together. And I just think that is the center of kind of what I would say my practice is. And I think that's why I think I can also then go into something like with Jay, any project with Jay, because I know that connection or that kind of collaborative, I don't know, it's like a something in the ether where there is some kind of a communication. It's not necessarily like who has what skills, but it's floating around, and we then just like ground it somehow. And I think just in the time that we've worked together, if, you know, I guess in answer to the question of like kind of what's evolved, I think it's just like an increasing sense of trust. So I can go into something without needing to worry. No, I don't feel like I need to plan, because I think there's a base level of like creative, collaborative. There's some kind of like soup that we comfortably can sit in together and create from. And then I'm always kind of in awe of the fact that, because I am very about sound, I'll be very much, I guess I want to say channeling, if we're going to keep talking about Tombland and ghosts and this kind of thing. I'm just about kind of channeling things into sound. But I think Jay can do that in multiple ways. And then so I learn a lot from observing that, and from observing kind of how I can just be responding to a space and responding to what we're doing. And then Jay can create a game. That's, that's a real big thing to observe in practice, how it kind of comes into being. And I think that's just the evolving nature, I think, of how every time we interact is me being like, wow, it could end up being anything. This is exciting. I don't know. Let's go.
It's so great, because I was thinking about it. I was listening to you, the tracks and stuff, and thinking about you working together and how much kind of vulnerability you would need to be able to kind of display to be able to do that together and just not feel self-conscious or not like, and just go with it and trust that each of you have got it and are. It must just be such a wonderful space to be in.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think that's why I thought that video was such a nice one to share with everyone of the working process, because I remember that moment where I think I just kind of looked over and I think Wen was just in this like trance like state. I was like, what are you doing? And then I was like, oh my God, yeah, this is really incredible. Like, this is amazing. And you don't always get to like, first of all, you don't necessarily get the opportunity to be in a medieval building. But then you don't always get the chance to do that with someone who's as open to the spirits as you are.
That I am.
I mean,
I have to say,
we like just jammed and kind of improvised, like the first day, which is, you know, like an hour-long conversation of just. And I think this is the thing, like this thing of improvisation is like in music, it's there, right? It's been there from day. It's been done. You know what I mean? But it just never stops giving. Like I think what you say about the trust and the vulnerability, once you understand that vulnerability is how things are made. Like, you have to be open, you have to let things happen, you can't control the outcome or whatever. Once you like learn that, you can apply it in so many ways. I mean, even with the game, when made all these sounds, I just said they need to be certain pitches or whatever, and then I also had to be vulnerable to the programmer, right? I was working with a dev to design the space and all the rest of it, and writing out how it should work and operate. And at some point, I had to be a bit like, just like with poetry, really. Like, I realized that I was giving him instructions, and he was just kind of doing something, and then I'd look back at my instructions and what he did, and I'd be like, there's a gap here. And then I had to just be like, no, you can't expect a collaborative project to look like it's going to look like it was in your head. Okay, there's going to be Mwen sounds, there's going to be Geordie's like design, and there's going to be like your sort of weird tentacle fingers somewhere in there as well. You know what I mean? Like, but it can't, you can't try and control it, and I think that's also what gives it a lightness. Like, I feel like Tombland is really a fun project, even though it's dealing with, I think, the very serious and very real nature of what it means to kind of create,
I was thinking about that, Jay, in contrast to poetry, though, too, which the process of editing and refining and the specificity of the word choices and how kind of like pinpoint accurate that is, and how this is just so different. And I'm just so inspired by people like you have that incredible range to your creative practice where you can do both of those things, which in my head feel like they're very far away from each other, but it comes together in a sort of whole that seems to make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the piece, it's gone through so many different lives already, from the kind of live element of being in the room through to I think there's been 5 iterations of it, that all feel really different and have all been really different. And even though it's in a playable state now, it's still got that kind of like endearing janky quality that I love about projects like this, where it's like, how do you even download it? Like, how do you move? How does this work? Because it's kind of moving away from, I think, the standardized experience that we currently have online, right? Where everything is sort of like spelled out to you, and you get a tutorial every time you go on a website now. You know what I mean? This is almost the opposite. You kind of got to go under the hood a little bit, and so we're still really open. We're like, if anyone is watching this and is a programmer or does music and has some ideas about it, I'd love to hear more. I guess in terms of what we would like to evolve. I mean, when you had some really good ideas about what you kind of wanted to do next in terms of sound, right?
Generally, not specific. I don't know specifically. I suppose specifically to this project, it would be really interesting if people were interested in sound were able to repurpose some of the sounds and generate their own art. I'm always interested in that. I'm always open to that. But yeah, I think this really there's been a kind of desire to do more kind of which was probably definitely influenced by like the last year, but kind of more projects where people are able to engage with meditative spaces online. Because I think the thing I really appreciate about this game is you don't have to solve anything. You don't have to do anything. You can very much just engage with it in a very open way. You don't have to use your mind too much. And I think but you also then get to feel like you're in some kind of a space. And I think I'd be really interested in doing more projects around that, where it's figuring out how to create these online or like just kind of digital environments that you can be immersed in without asking too much of you. Just kind of like, how can we create a space that's accessible in a huge way that you can just be like, I'm just gonna go into this room and just be in there. I feel like that was something that I would have appreciated sort of last year, and like after spending some time I mean, sometime after spending an awful lot of time kind of like in one space, it would just be nice, because I think there's also something about the idea of how you can create a 3D space, so you can put your headphones on and you can start to hear sounds all around you, while still in this geographical space, this actual physical hard location. I'm really interested in trying to sort of do more around that, I think, but with a definite undertone of not trying to create spaces that are like feeling that are open and healing and kind of meditative. That would be a really interesting direction that I hope to kind of go further in over time.
It does feel like that sort of work is more than right for this moment too. When we're going to have to just wrap up in a minute or two, but I wanted to ask you, because you've done quite a few remixes and stuff in the past, and I was having a listen to your the Childish Gambino one. It's so good. I just loved it so much. And I wanted to ask you about your kind of view on like pieces of art. Like, is anything ever really truly finished, or can everything just continue to evolve?
I think for me personally, I am very capable of finishing what I have to bring to the table. I think there is an end to what I'm trying to express, and I can reach it. But I then also think, like, so my remixes are a really good example of how I continue on what I feel an artist has done. So it's not just like, if I do a remix, it's not because I'm like, oh, I just want to put my stamp on this. It's like I do very specific remixes by very specific artists because I've connected to something in what they're in their art, and I want to develop it, or I want to support it, or I want to add a layer to it to be like, this is also how I feel about it. So like that, so that remix, the one that you've referenced, kind of came from a real thinking about what it is to be kind of like, I mean, in a very, I'm not going to get too deeply in it, but like how I was reflecting on the disconnection between being an African, because I'm African, and then African American, and then just kind of like thinking about what it would be to be this kind of, to be that disconnected. And so like a lot of the elements in there are very, come from that place. So like in that sense, that remix is finished to me, but it's born out of me wanting to carry on somebody else's art in some kind of a way. Like if that kind of answers it, I think.
Yeah, it does. I wasn't, I mean, to me, it feels like a completely finished and whole track, but just thinking about whether things are always open to kind of new interpretation and new possibility and ongoing dialogue with other artists, I guess. Jay, do you have any thoughts on that?
Not really, other than I agree really with Mwen. I think things can be both finished and still someone comes to it with an insight that they can then bring forward. If that's kind of how the world goes around, I would think. Like you have new interpretations of things over the years as society changes. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've got to finish up, I think. I just wanted to ask you one more thing. So if you, I guess that you kind of happened upon Dragon Hall and the whole area and were faced with the kind of history of all of that that space, and then you created something from it. Can you even begin to imagine what it would be like if somebody down the track happened across this work and this stuff that you've produced? And what do you think that would tell them about this moment that we're in now? And what would that experience be like?
I think for me, I hope it would be a real reflection, because of the fact that we as artists were able to be in that space and to be vulnerable in that space and to be creative in that space, and that might have been, the first time that bodies like ours, faces like ours, creatives like us have been able to do that there. I would hope that that would be something that they would be able to see, and that would be the mark that I would be hoping to leave. Like, it's not necessarily what was actually, not necessarily just all about what was created, but also about the creators and the creators engaging in authenticity in that space. I hope that would be part of how they were taking it in. I guess. Yeah.
Jay, what
I
about
agree.
you? What would you like people to take from it?
Yeah, like two absolute weirdos showed up in a medieval hall and were totally down for hanging out with whatever witch or merchant or whoever else was there. But I think also the idea that, if anything, if when people, I think, look back on this time, they might have something to say about the fact that we digitized the space and created a kind of analog to this elsewhere that could be kind of replicated infinitely. There's something probably in that that's very 2021.
Awesome. Right. Thank you so much, Jay and Wen, for chatting to us today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jenny, for hosting. And thank you, Norwich, as well, and the National Writers' Centre.